if you are new here, I used to be a costume designer, because what I'm doing today has me a bit confused. I used to work in film and TV in the costume department. I have a degree in costume design, but I mostly worked as a costume supervisor and as a costume standby on set. However, that's not what I do anymore. I am a knitwear designer and an indie hand dyer of yarns. So I run Fab Knitwear, which is my business. I used to work in costume, which had me very confused for a second, because the video I'm doing today is I'm going to be looking at period dramas, so films and TV shows set in the past that have knitwear in them, and then give you my opinion on these pieces, a little bit on the films, a little bit on the costumes, but I'm not going to go into a full costume review, simply because there are so many other brilliant content creators out there who have covered these films and series that I've found, but they don't really talk about knitwear. And as I have had and have a foot in each of those career paths and those spaces, I actually feel like this is something I have some actual expertise on. I am going to look at the knitwear for Outlander, the TV series, for Emma, the 2020 film, for Mary Shelley, and Little Women, the horror that was the newest adaptation of Little Women. First, there are some things that should be disclaimed, just in case so there's no confusion when I use terms and such. If you follow any other history or costume people on YouTube, you might already have heard that historical accuracy is not something that we can ever completely achieve today. We know what we know based on manuscripts, prints, fashion pamphlets and magazines from the past that have survived, from accounts of diaries and newspapers, gazettes, and of course remaining historical pieces that have survived through the years. But we don't really know. We pretend that we know a lot about them, but not everything will have survived and not everything will have been accurately described. It's my boyfriend's birthday and he's not home. He's been sent flowers, but I'm going to open them so that I can put them in water. I definitely think we should get to enjoy them before he comes home. What was I saying? Yes, historical accuracy. We do the best that we can, but when I use the term accurate, I just mean that accurate in what I have been able to gather and from what others have been able to gather. That does not mean it is 100% without a doubt accurate. Another thing to note is that costume design and historical accuracy are not necessarily one and the same. The designer or the production in general might not be aiming for historical accuracy, and that's fine. The job of the costume designer is to work with the rest of the production crew, so the producers, the directors, the other departments, hair and makeup, set design, all those departments, and everyone has their ideas, and you come together and you create a world. You are basically world building. That doesn't matter if you're doing a period piece or a fantasy piece or a modern piece, you have to create a believable world that these characters would act accordingly in. And that's basically the whole job. So the costume designer's job is to translate that through the use of clothing. If you have a world where the costumes don't fit in, but they're meant to, it's going to take you out of the story, and the other way around as well. If you have a gorgeous period piece, but they've not chosen the right locations, or the dialogue's wrong, and all these things matter, so it's really important to have a good collaboration. However, the two people, or there are usually more producers, but the host of people whose opinion matter the most are the director and the producers. And a costume designer has to work with them. They are working to create these people's vision. As a designer, you rarely get to do your own vision of things. But if you're a big designer, you will hire Colleen Atwood because of her aesthetic in comparison to another designer. So that's the main focus of a costume designer. You don't get to decide whether or not you should be historically accurate most of the time, unfortunately. That is decided by other departments. And you can have your say and you can argue back and forth about what's important or not, but just so that's clear, historical accuracy is not necessarily the goal of each production. I'm also going to touch briefly on the more specific job of the costume designer. So now we know they have to visually create the director and the producer's view and their vision. You have to manifest that in clothing. And not just clothing, you have to do character building, because you can't just put anyone in anything. That's not going to work. You have to put characters in clothing that make them believable characters, that translates how they are, how their personalities are, what they like, what they dislike, their ages and their preferences and their interests, and also their character arc. That's one of the really fun and important bits about costume, is how do certain characters develop over time, and how can you translate that into the use of clothing? And that's a really important part of costume design. So in pre-production, each character, as well as the story, is analysed in minute detail to make sure every aspect of each character has been evaluated, every stone has been turned to make sure you can put together the best possible wardrobe for each character, and also in regards to the whole world, because these characters also need to work together, and whether that's by creating divisions or showing unity to certain groups, all these things matter. You also need to take into account especially in period dramas, the characters' social standing. So a wealthy aristocrat will not wear the same clothing as a working person, and that also will have a deciding factor in how many changes there are per character, per film and per scene. Some characters will have loads of different clothing and you can't even keep track of when they change, but it's appropriate because of their social standing. Whereas other characters will wear the same thing for 2.5 hours, and that's appropriate for their character. So all of these things mesh together to create the world and the world building that you have to do as a costume designer. I think you as a viewer should never be distracted by the clothing. It should never take away from the story. And that doesn't mean you can't have outrageous fun pieces, because in some worlds that's completely appropriate. Just look at Bridgerton. It's outrageous and it's not accurate, but it works because that's the world that they've built. And you can also kind of see it in Emma, which is also one of the films I'm going to be talking about, where you have this beautiful, accurate world with accent pieces that are not accurate because it helps and aids the story. So I think my opinion is that it should never take away from the story, and you should never be distracted by it. It should just help tell the story. Let's start with Outlander, as that's the one set in the earliest historical periods. A note for all of these: if you haven't seen them and you don't want any spoilers, I can't promise that I'm not going to spoil things. So, spoiler alert for everything. I'm not planning on doing any spoilers, but I might let slip. So watch it first. Watch these things first if you're interested and you don't like potential spoilers. As I said, let's dive into Outlander. Outlander starts when Claire, a 1940s woman on her holiday in Scotland, travels through time to 1743. The whole premise, obviously by what I just said, is a fantasy setting placed in an actual time period. So this is a really fun premise, I think, because it allows the designer to play with the fact that someone from a different period can bring their tastes and their more modern interests and their skills into a completely different time period, and that will affect how they behave, how they dress, how they style things. And I think they did a really good job at this with Outlander in general.
Sure you don't mean to go out in public like this?
I most certainly do. I'll have you know I helped design this dress.
Outlander is fun because they actually have a lot of knitwear. I'm not going to tell you anything about the accuracy yet, but there is a lot. Before we dive into the actual review of the knitwear in Outlander, let's have a look at some general history facts about knitwear in the 18th century. Hand knitting in the 18th century seems to be confined to mostly accessories such as hats, mitts, stockings and gloves. There are some occasional findings of undershirts, but not really all that common. This is based on texts and imagery, as well as some surviving items from the actual period itself. As I said, there have been finds of men's shirts called waistcoats from the time, which were knitted undershirts, both from the 17th and 18th centuries. Not loads of them, but there are some, and the most famous example is Charles I, which he wore to his execution in 1649, or so it is said. However, these were not common, as most large garments were not hand knit, they were knit on the knitting frame. First knitting machine, which was developed by William Lee in 1589. There is, in other terms, not much to suggest that hand knitting was widely popular for garment knitting, when most historical evidence would suggest that accessories were by far the more common thing to knit by hand. However, we don't know that for certain. We think that, but there are some surviving pieces that suggest that they were knit to a very slight degree, probably for the very wealthy, such as Charles I. And we know they had the skills to do this, it just wasn't common, and it probably wasn't practical because of time. After the development of the knitting frame, the first ever knitting machine, most hand knitting, I should say, was either done by the very poor or the very wealthy as a form of leisure. The very poor because they couldn't afford machine knit. So to sum up the 18th century knitting, we can say that it was definitely done. We have surviving evidence of gloves, of mitts, of caps, of shirts. There's a lot, not a lot, that's taking it a bit too far, but there is evidence with showing all these things being worn, and we know poor people knit. It was taught in orphanages, being a useful skill, and the wealthy knit. Let's take a look at Scotland in particular, as this is where Outlander takes place. According to the book The Art of Feral Knitting, knitting in Scotland was such an important part of Scottish heritage that whole families and sometimes even villages were involved in making hand-knit garments such as sweaters, socks, stockings and gloves. So we know that hand knitting definitely had an important part in Scottish 18th century life. Now let's have a look at Outlander. What knits do we see in Outlander? Cowls, shawls and mitts. So many cowls, shawls and mitts. We've already established that there weren't all that much garment knitting happening in the 18th century apart from accessories. However, there aren't all that many shawls and cowls either. But let's have a look at the first knitted item that Claire is shown wearing. And I'm going to look at Claire and a little bit about Brianna, but I'm not going to go into all the other characters because Claire just wears so much knitwear. The first item that we see her in are mitts, some hand knit mitts. Now, we know that 18th century ladies wore mitts, but mostly they were sewn together by already woven fabric, so they weren't knit mitts. At least we don't know of any patterns for knit mitts from the 18th century. However, I don't have trouble imagining, like, if they could knit stockings and gloves, they could probably knit mitts, fingerless gloves as well, because they already used other mitts. How many times am I going to say that word? I've seen her in this picture of this lady in the red dress. She is wearing a pair of silk fingerless gloves, very common accessory at the time. However, this is the Highlands of Scotland, so silk fingerless gloves aren't really going to do it for you. The costume designer for Outlander is Terry Dressback. I'm not sure I pronounced that correctly. It's fine. Said that, and I have some quotes here, in Hollywood, we, the royal we, want to see cleavage. But much of the shooting takes place in cold, drafty castles where the leading lady and ladies were wearing just a bosom-bearing gown. She would die, freeze to death, or be stoned to death as a whore. And that the most important thing for her was not that the costumes were authentic, but that they felt right to the story. So knowing this, making fingerless mitts and fingerless gloves as part of these Highland women's costume, when you know they had rich knitting heritage in Scotland, and you know women of the 18th century wore silk mitts and mitts of other fabrics, I'm fine with this. It's an easy conclusion to draw as a designer. It's both practical and it fits. There is also a reference in Linda Baumgarten's What Clothes Reveal, where an 18th century knitter had an advertisement in a gazette or a magazine where she would remake old stockings into fingerless mitts. And that goes to show that it's not that much of a far-flung conclusion to draw that women would wear woolen mitts. Would they be hand knit? Don't know. Does it fit the show and the character? Absolutely. Claire wears several different mitts or fingerless gloves throughout all 5 seasons of Outlander, and they range both in style and look. Most of them are quite chunky. They are knit in stockinette or garter stitch, and they are quite plain. She also has a pair of cabled fingerless gloves, and those are probably the most far-fetched for me for the period. Although I think it's a nice homage to Scottish traditions, knitwear traditions. So all in all, the mitts, fingerless gloves, while not historically accurate based on what we know today, they do their job. They keep the actors warm, they give the costumes a nice layering piece, and they also texture. They give lovely texture to the shot, and they are based on garments that we know women wore at the time. We just don't know if this material was used and this technique. Another item that Claire wears a lot of are cowls. Claire has a plethora of cowls that she wears in Outlander. And if I'm not mistaken, and I might be because there's quite a lot of episodes and seasons, Claire and later Brianna are the only 2 characters who wears cowls. So I interpret that as these women are not from this time. They are cold. They know of a more practical way to keep your a higher chest and your throat and neck warm, which is cowls. Now I tried finding 1940s knitting patterns for cowls, and I couldn't find any, but turtlenecks, knit turtlenecks, were definitely a thing in the 40s. Hoods were a thing, and so Claire, doing some troubleshooting or creative thinking, I think it's believable that she could conjure up the idea of knitting herself a cowl in the 18th century, because none of the other original 18th century characters ever wear them that I can remember. So while these are definitely not historically accurate at all, they work with the character on the premise that Claire has used her time traveler's knowledge to make these herself. The one thing that Claire wears that I do not like at all knitting wise is her little shrug bolero thing in season 1 when she goes out with Galis. And again, we could do the premise that Claire has used her 1940s knitting skills to make this. Shrugs and boleros were definitely a thing then. I've not seen any 1940s patterns for these, but I have seen 1950s patterns for these. And so that's not far-fetched, but I just can't get past that other characters would be, like, they wouldn't know what she was wearing. She would be very strange and very weird, wearing this weird little loose gauge, very, very 70s, I think, bolero. And that's the worst one for me this early in the series. Another thing that she wears that's, I wouldn't really call it cowl, but it's not really a shawl, it's this little capelet thing. I actually like this because this looks very, very much like some battery. It looks very 1930s, 1940s, which is appropriate to where Claire's from. Little pixie elven looking things were really popular with little hoods and capes. And so I think this is really appropriate. Also capes and cloaks, definitely a thing in the 18th century. So while the other characters would probably be surprised, like, what are you wearing? How did you make this? Why are you wearing it? Why didn't you make it longer? I like it. I think it has fun 1930s, 40s references which suits the character's original birth period. Let's move on to Claire's shawls or wraps. The shawls that Claire wears in Outlander are traditionally referred to as sontags. Sontag not sure how to pronounce it. It's one of those words that I've read so many times, but I have no idea how to pronounce. Which is a type of wrap which became popular in the 1860s. That's a good 120 years later than Outlander. And again, we could pretend that it's because Claire's a time traveller, had it not been for the fact that so many other characters wear these wraps. And I get it. I mean, they look great, they look gorgeous worn over fitted bodices. They look like they belong in the 18th century. They just don't. And don't get me wrong, they wore shawls and they wore wraps, they just weren't knitted or hand knit. Mostly shawls of the time were lace shawls, which were very beautiful but not very warm, or they were made from woven materials. Woven wool would have been a better use of shawls at the time. And Claire does have a really nice tartan woven, why is this so difficult to say? Woven shawl in much of Outlander, and I really like that. But I also understand why they opted for knitted shawls, because they do give the costumes and the general aesthetic of the series such a nice textured rustic vibe. So while not in the slightest bit historically accurate, they look really good. As I said, the shawls that Claire wears are called a Sontag. These were typically V-shaped shawls or habits that were draped across the shoulders and that would either tie at the waist or tie around your bust and waist to hug your frame and give you warmth. These were typically worn under your coat or cape, but over your bodice. So with all that said, all the references I could find on shawl knitting in the 18th century all said they didn't do it. However, I did find one reference to a specific type of knitted shawl made in Europe in the 18th century. Some even say as far back as the 17th century, which is the Russian Oremburg shawls, which originated in Oremburg, which is on the south slope of the Urian Alps. And they're these beautiful hand-spun and hand-knit lace, gossamer lace shawls knit in goat. And goat, as with mohair today, is so warm. And these are beautiful, handcrafted, delicate, expertly made pieces that they did export, but they would have been incredibly pricey to export. So these would have been bought, I'm guessing, I could find very little on this, they would have been exported probably purely for royalty and aristocrats. Probably not all the way up to rural Highland Scotland, although I can't say for sure. And so I think for this instance, for Outlander, in the Highlands, with the rustic wools that they use in the costumes, with all these things, I think the knitwear helps elevate the costumes and they don't distract from it. However, they are not accurate. The only problem I have with some of them is how chunky they are, because some of them are so chunky, and knitwear, historical knitwear, is infamous for its tiny, 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 almost like robotic machine-like gauge. My fingers ache just thinking about the gauge that these knitters produced. Oh, one item I completely forgot. Her mid-century knitted jacket at the end of season 5. What was that? Completely took me by surprise, because as I think all the other accessories helped elevate the costumes, this one did not do that. This was a typical 20th century, mid-century knit with, it was long, it was obviously hand knit, so it didn't look like anything that could have been referenced in regards to garment knitting of the past. It just looked so out of place. And again, we have seen Claire knitting in the show, so we know she's a knitter. And again, she's a time traveller. She will probably have known how to knit garments from the 1940s. But other characters would have reacted to seeing someone in the 18th century wearing a mid-20th century knit jacket. I also super quickly want to touch on Brianna's cowl that she wears, and I really like this, and this is not accurate at all, but it's something that she either brings with her or gets a hold of very quickly as she enters the 18th century. So I'm assuming she knit this in the 1970s herself. All in all, Outlander, really enjoyed the knitwear. Really enjoyed the costumes in general. I love how they played with this time traveler aspect of these women bringing their own personal styles and tastes back to the 17th century, making it practical for them there. We know Claire, for instance, had a pair of zip-up stays, which is really fun. Yeah, I think they did a really good job. It's not accurate. It doesn't really matter because it aids the story and doesn't take away from it. The next film in my review is Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley came out in 2018 and it's the story of Mary Wollstonecraft Goodwin, the author of, amongst others, Frankenstein and the modern egg Prometheus. She married, actually that's not true, she met poet Percy Shelley in 1814 and started a romantic relationship with this married man out of wedlock. So we can already here establish Mary Shelley was a bit of a bohemian. The story mostly takes place in England and Switzerland, so we know the time and we know the place. We know it starts in 1940 and then covers her early years. This period of fashion and this era in general is known as the Regency era, where the silhouette was very straight and column-like. Let's have a look at some of the knitwear in Mary Shelley because they actually have 3 pieces on Mary, which is played by Elle Fanning. Mary's first outfit includes a piece of knitwear that she is seen wearing through a lot of the film. And I like this because they didn't have, back in the day, you didn't have 60 pieces in your wardrobe. You had a few. And whenever designers think about that and incorporate it into their costuming, I really appreciate that. I like it. So she wears this for a lot of the film under various garments, both on its own and as a mid-layer. It's this nice rustic red garter stitch Spencer jacket that looks to be knit from hand-dyed yarn. What I like the most about this jacket is the ruffled hem at the end that looks like the ruffles you would have on many original Spencer jackets found from the time and depicted at the time. A Spencer is a short cropped jacket that ends just at your underbust that fits nicely with the empire waist silhouette and dresses of the time. They came with or without tails at the back and they could be both long sleeved, short sleeved and have puff shoulders. They often came in contrasting colours to the dresses, and we know light dresses were very popular at the time. So you have loads of lovely Spencers that you see today from the time in red and pinks and yellows and blues and browns, and they would be the statement piece of your outwear worn with a bonnet. These outfits, these Spencer jackets, started appearing in the 1790s but remained in vogue until the mid-1820s. The necklines range from high, ruffled statement necklines to more subdued crew necks to V-necks and even slightly rounded square ones. When they were lower, they were always worn with a fichu, which is a sheer bit of fabric that was worn to cover the bust for modesty. Mary's second Spencer is a blue one that also looks to be knit with hand-dyed yarn. This one is also cropped and has a V-neck. For some reason this one has a much more modern feel to me than the previous one. It also has a strange sleeve length. I have found one reference picture to a Spencer jacket or a bodice with these elbow length sleeves, but they are by no means common. The most common length was either a short one or as in a t-shirt length, or a short one with a dress underneath, or a long sleeve Spencer jacket. But I do think as a knitted garment it looks strange. The whole point of introducing knitwear in these films when knitted garments weren't really a thing, I'm assuming, is for warmth, and that doesn't really do the job when you are cutting the sleeves enough. However much I have looked for patterns and references to knit Spencer jackets, I have not found any. So I can't say for sure they didn't exist, but I have not found any references to them. However, as I said with Outlander, when you take obvious inspiration from the existing silhouettes and cuts and fashions of the time in which you are setting your show, and you make a knitted garment, both for aesthetic purposes and to keep the actors and actresses warm, I'm absolutely fine with it. They obviously tried making Spencer jackets. I can see where the reference comes from, and I think it works even though it's not accurate. Not so sure about the blue one, but I quite like her rustic red one. The one and last piece of knitwear from Mary Shelley is horrible. It is so bad in this setting. It's a light grey cropped raglan pullover. Yes, you heard me correct. And it doesn't work at all. I wish they'd have kept it to those two Spencer jackets or knit another one. This ruined it for me so bad. The only thing I can say about this that's even remotely Regency is the fact that it has the right crop. It ends just at the underboob. And while the Spencers are not historically accurate either, they are at least hinting at historical accuracy. This? No. So to sum up Mary Shelley knitwear wise, I really appreciate the fact that they opted for knitwear, even if it's not historically accurate, because I think it suits Mary's character. Is it accurate? Not at all. Would she have worn her hair like that? Most definitely not. But I think knitwear wise, at least the first Spencer, the rust red one, I really like. The other two I'm not too fussed about, and the last one I abhor. Let's move on to Emma, which is a Jane Austen novel published in 1915. So I'm going to assume it's around the same time as Mary Shelley. This is set, so also the Regency era. I can't talk about Emma without acknowledging the fact that it's probably the most superb costume drama. Everything is brilliant. The costumes, the sets, the dialogue, the directing, everything. You can tell it's a team that's really worked together and pulled together to create the best possible end product that they could. And there is knitwear in this. Before I dive into the knitwear, let me just say that the costumes for Emma are so accurate. They have done a brilliant job. They have referenced actual pieces that we have in museums today and made versions of those for Emma, the character. This is next level. Like, nothing compares to this. This is so good. And I know I said I don't care about accuracy if it doesn't help the story, but in this case, it elevated it because of the accuracy, because everything worked together to make a really believable world. Whereas accuracy in Outlander wouldn't really have, I don't think it would have done the same because it has more of a fantasy premise. So I hope you see the difference of why I appreciate them, but in their own ways. Emma, so accurate. They did such a good job. They also took some liberties with the knitwear because there's no evidence of knitted Spencers in the Regency era, and Harriet is seen wearing a lovely, gorgeous red knit Spencer when she goes to tea with Emma. This is a liberty that has been taken. However, because everything else is so accurate, I feel like there's a reason they took the liberties that they did. They were very intentional. They must have weighed the risks of, are we going to use this thing even if it's not accurate? Because Emma's sat there in her beautiful, lovely muslin dress and looks so sleek and elegant. And then there's Harriet, who is of questionable upbringing and who is socially quite clumsy and innocent and is drinking her tea imitating Emma, and she's wearing this red and white gingham dress with this rustic red knit Spencer on top. And when we know that knitting was something taught in orphanages and the poorhouses, it just creates such a nice character divide in regards to Emma's and Harriet's social standing. And I think it's really efficient, and they also did, they knit this to make it look like an authentic Spencer jacket. It looks like they took the pattern for a woolen Spencer and just knit it instead of cut it up in fabric. It's so well made and it looks beautiful. They're not even hinting at accuracy with this. They made, I dare say, an accurate Spencer just in an inaccurate fabric. It works all the better because of all the other accuracies. There is another knit, actually it's not knit, another crochet pattern in this, another garment in Emma, and it's also Harriet wearing this. It's a rewear from the film Bright Star, and it's a crocheted, pastel coloured, little shrug, bolero, Spencery looking thing. It's super whimsical and girly. I think it's super cute. Is it Regency? Not in the slightest, but it's so lovely on Harriet. It fits in with the birthday party, the childishness. And again, it must have been a calculated decision because they didn't take these liberties with many other characters. And so all in all, I have only good things to say about the way they use knitwear in Emma, even though it's not historically accurate. The last piece I'm going to talk about is the newest adaptation of Little Women. I know. As most people who enjoy a bit of period drama, Little Women was not for me. And I'm not here to review the film, I just want to I just have to say it. I didn't like this film, and I didn't like the costumes, but there is knitwear in this, and there is some actual accurate knitwear in this. So credit where credit is due, I say. First scene where we are shown knitwear in Little Women is when all the sisters are walking together, and two of the sisters are wearing sotangs, whatever, however it is you pronounce them, the wraps, the habits, the shawls, and three of the sisters are wearing hand knit mitts. One sister is wearing a ridiculous ruffled collar. Let's talk about each of these knitted items. First, let's look into the habits. So both Beth and Amy wear habits or these wraps. As I mentioned in the Outlander section, these became popular in the 1860s, and that's when Little Women is set. They were super popular in North America in the 1860s during the Civil War. So wholly, fully, super appropriate, very accurate. Points for this. I also really like how they made them different. Beth, who is the more delicate, fragile, dare I say, character and sister, has this lovely pink mauve wrap with the darker purple pink edges, and this is a detail that is prevalent in historical references from the time of this line and these details. And I think they did a really good job with this. Whereas Amy, who is the youngest sister and would probably have been wearing a lot more hand-me-downs than she did in the film. This is the only time I think they actually managed this. Hers is like a greyish brown, and it's just the normal regular garter stitch one. It's not very fancy, which is appropriate for the time, being the younger sister. I really, really like the fact that they are wearing these. I like the way each character wears them. That's all the good I can say about that. But they are accurate. They're also wearing mitts. Both Beth, Amy and Jo are all wearing colourwork mittens. Now, I don't know enough about colourwork history in the USA to claim anything to or from about whether this is accurate in the United States, but I can say that this type of knitwear and this style of knitting was starting to gain popularity in both Norway and Latvia at the time. The style of knitting looks a lot like Selbu mittens, which was a Norwegian colourwork mitten that was credited to, double check, Marit from Selbu in 1857. So, time-wise, things are looking really good. I wasn't able to find any dates or specifics about Latvian colourwork mittens, but I know there is a rich and glorious history of colourwork mittens from Latvia. Probably other European countries and non-European, for that matter, countries, but these are the two that I know of. We also know there was a lot of migration from Norway to the North States of the USA during the 19th century. So it's not that far-fetched to think that Norwegians might have come over, brought their heritage and their knitwear traditions and simply continued with their knitting lives in the States. So all in all, I think this, I don't know if this was a thing in the USA in the 1860s, but I know it was a thing here. And all in all, it adds up. I think this is accurate. The last bit of knitwear that I'm going to comment on from Little Women is Amy's ridiculous knitted collar. I couldn't find any collars like this from the 1860s. I was able to find patterns for hoods and collars from the 1870s and up, and there's also this pattern from 1903 which really reminds me of what she's wearing around her neck. But I think this was more of a character styling choice than an accurate choice. And I think because Amy is shown to be more childish, she is the youngest sister, this really helps her look, helps show her youth and show her more childish behaviour. So with that in mind, I think it's fine. But seeing as the rest of the frame and the rest of the costumes are so chaotic, this is like the final drop that makes it bad. If you had taken this inaccurate collar and placed it on an accurate costume, it could have added that bit of character that you saw they successfully did in Emma. So that's my opinion on that collar, but the habits and also the mitts are, from what I can gather, historically accurate for the time. That's my review and my take on these 4 series and films. I'm very excited to hear what you think, if you had any favourites of them, if you disagree with me, or if you know any other fun films and TV shows with knitwear. Mostly historical. I have a whole list of more recent vintage films, so 20th century shows and series films with knitwear. But it's quite fun to see them in an older setting, just to be able to do that research and look into it properly, and also do the character analysis for each of them. Because as I said, I think you always have to weigh up, is it inaccurate? Does it add to the story? Liberties are allowed to be taken, and when it works, it really works. As a knitwear designer and a knitter in general, I really like seeing knitwear in film, even if it's not historically accurate, if it helps tell the story. I will see you next time. Bye!